any further delays, I'd like to ask Jeffrey to come up on the stage and welcome him and thank him for his time and his courage.
Thank you, Laura. You know, we live in an age where it's demanded that we see everything through a prism of nuance, through moral and cultural relativism. But you know, sometimes things are really just about black and white, right and wrong, good and evil. Drug trafficking and abuse is unquestionably one of those things. So is terrorism, and so is everything in between. And we're actually going to spend the next hour talking about that entire broad spectrum. Former U.S. Attorney Andrew McCarthy once said that civilization does not come about, nor does it survive by accident. It must be defended. It must be upheld by those committed to civility, decency, and adherence to the law. Our society is not some naturally occurring evolution, but is actually the imposition of human good over human evil. And as we know, the good requires constant reinforcement, whereas the bad just needs permission. And as we go about fighting our various enemies and adversaries, both foreign and domestic, there will be no easy political fix, no magic bullet. What we do is hard, and it's hard all the time. Now, this quote comes from the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. And to be fair, he was actually just talking about trying to stem the flow of narco dollars to the bad guys and the terrorists in that country at that time. But this applies to us all right here, right now as well. This is not a war on drugs we're fighting, not literally. It's a struggle. It's a hard, perpetual struggle against complex social, criminal, and pharmacological forces pushing constantly and insidiously against the safety and well-being of our citizens. And as drug trafficking and international terrorism increasingly converge and intersect into that realm we now call narco-terrorism, this problem is no longer one that simply involves our public health and public safety, but our very national security. Now, if you take a look at the tactics and the methods of both terrorist organizations and traffickers, they're remarkably similar. The only difference really is just a matter of degree. You see, terrorists look to overthrow the entire existing political order, replace it with perhaps a form of communism or socialism or an Islamic caliphate. Drug traffickers, not so much. They only look to degrade and erode those government forces that oppose them, so they can continue to use the weakened husk of the nation state to make money off the backs of addiction. They're both highly compartmentalized, operating in cellularized structures. They both depend on what we call shadow facilitators, those support players that provide weapons, chemicals, communications, money laundering services. They're both single-minded, zealous, highly ethnocentric, and shockingly violent. Oh, and one more thing, whether we like it or not, they both take our forgiving multiculturalism and our moral and cultural relativism as weakness. Now, everybody knows about the ABCs of WMD, right? But for the most part, these are potential threats to Americans on any given day. It's actually the next letter in our alphabet soup that's killing more than 107,000 Americans every year and rising. That's that's almost 300 every single day. Let me ask you, what do you think our media would say on the news every night if 300 dolphins were to wash up dead on our beaches every day? Huh? Well, you know the answer to that. But in addition to the deaths, 4 million Americans every year enter substance abuse treatment. 2 million visit hospital emergency rooms with drug poisoning symptoms. 1/4 of them from that supposed safe natural drug, marijuana. And lastly, we have recently crossed the threshold of illegal drugs costing our society more than $1 trillion a year in lost productivity, criminal justice, health-related, and social costs of every kind. If I were going to introduce a substance to hollow out a society from within, I could think of nothing better than drugs to do it with. Now, of all the foreign terrorist organizations as so designated by our U.S. government throughout the world, more than 1/3 of them have been definitively linked to the drug trade, supporting themselves in whole or in part by narcotics distribution. Every political stripe, religious orientation one can think of, pretty much all over the globe, on just about every single continent, with one glaring exception up here. Specifically, we don't see anything to that country just to our south, and we're going to talk about that. But let's take a look at what happens when we overlay drug production zones globally, and we're just talking about the organics, principally cocaine and heroin, not the synthetics, which can be produced anywhere, as well as those drug flows to international markets. As those flows pass through territories controlled by, or at least occupied by, foreign terrorist groups, they would be remiss if they didn't try to parasitically attach themselves somehow to the drug trade, and increasingly they do. We know the money to be made from drug trafficking is actually not in their production, it's moving them to market. So using cocaine as an example here, you can get a kilo of cocaine today in Cartagena, Colombia, for instance, for about $2,500. Move that same kilo to Houston, Texas, Kansas City, Seattle, New York, increase your profit tenfold. If you move that kilo to Western Europe, 20-fold. And if you have the guts and the connections to sell a kilo of cocaine in communist China today, that can fetch you as much as $200,000. There simply is no more lucrative illicit product on the global stage better than dope. Not weapons, not human beings, not even cigarette smuggling. $400 billion is the annual level of international drug trafficking globally, according to the UN. So going after drug trafficking organizations is not just critical to protecting our own citizens. It actually becomes key in denying revenue to foreign terrorists throughout the globe. Let me just talk about a few of these very briefly. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, sort of the quintessential narco-terrorist organization, been around for many years. They are actually the paramilitary army of the Communist Party of Colombia. Long supported themselves with kidnappings and extortions, targeted assassinations, have become highly adept over the years at not just drug trafficking, principally cocaine, but also heroin, but also trading cocaine for military-grade weapons throughout the world, not just destabilizing their own country to overthrow the democratic government in Colombia, but increasingly bringing drugs to the rest of the world. The Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path of Peru, consisting mainly of indigenous people from the Apurimac and Huallaga valleys of Peru, the principal coca growing and cocaine production region in that country, long supported themselves through taxing the cocaine trade. But over the years, they ended up evolving and became one of Peru's biggest drug trafficking groups, still dedicated to the overthrow of that government. They were beaten back greatly in the 2000s, but thanks to new left-wing governments in that country, they've actually been allowed to resurge and flourish and become larger than they ever have in the past. Hezbollah, sort of the poster child for Middle Eastern terrorism, consisting of Lebanese Shia militia members dedicated to the overthrow, or excuse me, the complete destruction of Israel, as well as the United States. Thanks to sanctions against Iran, their major supporters over the years in recent history, much of their support has dried up. So they have increasingly turned to international drug trafficking, not just hashish and heroin, but also a cheap amphetamine called Captagon throughout Europe. And due to the Lebanese diaspora throughout the world, a lot of people don't realize we have about 200,000 Lebanese immigrants currently living in Mexico, many of them supportive of Hezbollah. The Kurdish workers have long fought a separatist insurgency against Turkey, support themselves primarily through heroin trafficking in Western Europe. Europol will tell you that 80% of all the heroin sold on the streets of Paris, Brussels, Frankfurt is done by ethnic Kurds with ties to the PKK. Europol will tell you that somewhere between $1.5 to $3 billion a year is what they garner in heroin sales, which buys a lot of military weapons to target our NATO ally, Turkey. Our old friends in Afghanistan, as many of you may already know, Afghanistan has always been a traditional opium and heroin producing nation. But under our watch, in the last 20 years, as we tried to turn a medieval society into a Jeffersonian democracy with billions and billions of dollars in taxpayer assistance, they actually have morphed into the largest opium and heroin producer of the world. They now produce 90% of the global supply of heroin. 70% at least of all the support that goes to the Taliban government right now to fund their operations comes from the drug trade. And now, after what many people consider to be the greatest foreign policy debacle of our lifetime, they now also sit on $80 billion worth of some of the finest military hardware in the world. Many of you might recognize the gentleman on the left, Victor Bout, in handcuffs there, also known as the Merchant of Death. Former Soviet intelligence officer turned one of the world's largest black market arms dealers. At the height of his activity, he was actually moving as many as 6 Ilyushin 76 cargo planes full of military goods and weapons every single day into Afghanistan, supplying the Taliban. Where he really ran afoul of U.S. law, however, was when he agreed to sell surface-to-air shoulder-fired missiles to the FARC guerrillas in Colombia in order to shoot down U.S. aircraft operating there, conducting counter-narcotics. That's him in 2011 in handcuffs being escorted to U.S. federal court from a DEA sting in Bangkok, Thailand. And now, you may have seen the news lately, our current administration is offering up the Merchant of Death in a trade for Brittany Griner here, who was arrested for smuggling marijuana concentrates into Russia. She is not a political prisoner. She's a drug smuggler. What do you think? Fair trade for the Merchant of Death? Okay, let's bring it a little closer to home, just to capitalize on what Jason has already talked about so well. Americans currently spend over $150 billion a year buying illegal drugs, where roughly half of that, $75 billion, ends up finding its way into the coffers of the various Mexican cartels. That kind of money doesn't just destabilize governments. It allows these criminal cartels to be more powerful than the federal government itself in large swaths of the country. Now, if many of you remember the Colombian cartels, the cocaine cowboys of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you know that they were very, very good at combining international drug trafficking with violence. But the Mexicans today make them look like pikers. Not only the violence, but the Mexicans have become very adept at what global economists call market diversification, both the vertical and horizontal integration of markets. Vertically, meaning they've come to dominate every level of production, trafficking, smuggling, wholesale distribution, right down to retail level drug sales, not just in our country, but in more than 50 others throughout the world. But also horizontally, the various cartels have branched out into drugs not traditional to Mexico, beginning with methamphetamine in the 90s, and of course lately fentanyl, but also beyond drugs themselves into new types of organized crime, not just human trafficking, auto theft, piracy, but illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal wildlife trafficking of exotic species to China. There's a slang term now they use in Mexico called a huachicolero, which roughly translates into an oil pirate. Every 90 minutes there's an illegal tap on a Pemex oil pipeline in Mexico in order to sell oil on the black market, each one sanctioned by one of the criminal cartels. It's about to bring that state-run oil company to its knees. Now, you don't necessarily need to be an expert on the territorial boundaries in Mexico of the various cartels, but you might want to know who's in your own backyard. DEA puts this map out from time to time, and I think they're due for an update, showing various cartel presence inside the U.S. With various levels of ownership if you will, in some of our big cities, along with unspecified presence in the shaded areas here, which roughly correspond to our population density across the country. Homeland Security will tell you that the various Mexican cartels have a presence in over 3,000 American cities and towns. They are here solely to sell dope to Americans. I can think of no greater example of Cicero's warning to his fellow Romans about allowing an enemy within the gates. Now we know, just like the terrorists, the drug cartels today practice terror and barbarity to actually accomplish two goals. The first, quite obviously, is to cow and crush any opposition, be it the government, rival traffickers, or the general public. But it also serves a second purpose, which may in fact be more important, and that is it tends to invigorate and intensify faith among their membership. We've actually had just a handful of Mexican sicarios, or hitmen, who have cooperated with American law enforcement and talk about how absolutely exhilarating it is to kill on behalf of your organization, your team, to cut somebody's heart out, to skin somebody alive and then cut his hand off, placing it on his throat to tell the world that this guy was a snitch. I would remind you that terrorism is not a specific entity, nor is it a particular ideology. It's a tactic. And it's a tactic being deployed every day by every single one of these Mexican cartels to control corridors into the United States. You know, several years ago, the world was aghast when ISIS in Syria and northern Iraq was using young boys to cut the heads off of infidels. They've been doing this for a long time in Mexico. Only now we welcome these little dreamers into our country, hoping one day they're going to be valedictorians or Harvard graduates, when in fact the vast majority of them end up gravitating back to the only life they know, which is the gang life. And quite simply, the retail level distribution handled by gangs across the country make them really the foot soldiers, the proxies for their big brothers in the cartels. And like those big brothers, they too are single-minded, zealous, highly ethnocentric, and very violent. By the way, anybody know how many law enforcement officers we have in this country entirely? Badge carriers of every kind, local, state, federal, tribal? 800,000. That's all. So with all the other tasks that law enforcement has every single day, 24/7, they're already outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 just by the gangbangers alone. Okay, let's talk about the origins and the genesis of the most violent and terroristic of all the Mexican drug cartels, Los Zetas. Story begins in 1999 when the government of Mexico creates the GAFIs here, consisting of 350 of the finest men that the Mexican military had to offer, given the finest equipment, weapons, training, much of it compliments of Uncle Sam and Fort Benning. These guys were very good, designed to go after the heart of every single one of the cartels. They were exceptional at aerial assaults, counter-surveillance, secure communications, redundant systems of every kind. But almost immediately, one particular subunit among the GAFIs, a 30-man unit known as the Z unit, and Zeta is simply the letter Z in Spanish, defected en masse to go to work as the private mercenary army of the Gulf Cartel. With them, they take their tactics, their weapons, their training, and they begin to incorporate new levels of terroristic acts. They pick up from watching videos posted by Al-Qaeda from Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, all 30 members of the original Zeta unit have been killed or captured, but not before they rapidly expanded and by franchising gangs all across Mexico, training them in those same tactics and terroristic acts. Here's one such training camp they set up. As you can see, not just small arms, but military-grade weapons, RPGs, law rockets, fragmentation grenades. Oh, and by the way, this particular camp, just 60 miles from the U.S. border. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been fundamentally unserious about protecting ourselves at our southern border, not just from drug smugglers and human traffickers, but from narco-terrorists. After violently separating themselves from the Gulf Cartel, the Zetas literally roll onto the scene when 5 severed heads are thrown onto a crowded discotheque dance floor in Acapulco, Mexico, announcing to the world that they were now a new cartel. This didn't just shock the world, it took rival traffickers completely by surprise that such new levels of barbarity and terror would be used in trafficker-on-trafficker disputes. And of course, the rival traffickers didn't then just respond in kind, they had to up the ante in an escalating game of quid pro quo. You couldn't just cut heads off anymore, you then ended up dismembering entire bodies, scattering the pieces in macabre public displays, along with what became known as a narcomanta, a narcotics messaging banner. This one here announcing to the world the presence of another new cartel, La Familia Michoacana. And unfortunately, this kind of violence didn't just stay contained within the traffickers and the bad guys, it would engulf the good guys. And I'm not talking about corrupt Mexican cops. They get killed every day working for the wrong side. I'm talking about trained, vetted, hand-picked Mexican federal agents working with their counterparts in DEA and HSI, targeted precisely because they were uncorrupted. Captured, tortured, killed, stacked like cordwood on the side of the road in violation of every civilizational standard I know. This is not mere crime. This is terrorism. And this calls for the tools of counterterrorism. And here's one of the byproducts today. 5 of the 6 most dangerous cities in the world are in Mexico. And this is not about real war like in Ukraine or sectarian strife in the Middle East. This is just about controlling plazas or corridors into the U.S., as well as controlling other global organized crime. Okay, I want to change gears just a little bit. The term war on drugs actually has become so defiled and corrupted over the years, it's produced an untold number of so-called experts who claim that they have a better way to go. America's been doing it all wrong. Experts like Brad Pitt, who says America's war on drugs has been a charade simply because he can land in any American city and buy whatever shit you need in 24 hours. Yeah, that makes him an expert. Or Richard Branson says America's drug war has been a failure because he thinks we now run a police and prison state imprisoning masses of our citizens. Well, even Time magazine has described Sir Richard Branson as a man filled with too much hubris, too much hucksterism, and too little knowledge. And then there's former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, who says it's useless because his country, Mexico, has paid an undue price, being sandwiched between drug producer and drug consumer nations. Well, with all due respect to Senor Fox, not only is Mexico a drug-producing nation, it is the principal drug-producing nation in terms of methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, as well as the shipment of ton quantities of both cocaine and, yes, still marijuana into our country. What all of these so-called self-anointed experts are selling is actually not expertise in any way. What they're selling, to use a highly academic term that I've encountered in my 40 years of experience and research in law enforcement, is bullshit. Now, excuse me for using a vulgar term here today, but I actually do mean that in a quasi-academic way. Because many years ago, Harry G. Frankfurt, professor of philosophy at Princeton University, wrote a scholarly paper called On Bullshit that analyzed the social consequences of a diminishing respect for truth in our culture. The bullshitter, he said, does not oppose himself to the authority of the truth as the liar does. He simply pays no attention to it at all. So in this way, bullshit is actually a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. Professor Frankfurt further defined bullshit as simply an indifference to how things really are. So the danger to our society lies precisely in this regard for the truth as insignificant, as irrelevant. Think about that tonight when you're watching the mainstream news. Now, To get to the truth on our nation's current ordeal with drugs, we have to go back to the 1960s. It didn't start then, but it certainly exploded. Our current problem with drugs in this country, according to social scientist James Q. Wilson, is due to two factors. Number one, we happen to be in this country simultaneously the most free and the most prosperous society in the history of the world. And in the 1960s, all that free time and disposable income led to new forms of recreation at precisely the same time that modern chemistry was bringing online new forms of psychoactive substances, uppers, downers, all-arounders. Number two, the baby boom generation, having come of age in the 1960s, was so large and so sudden that instead of being absorbed into the dominant culture, we allowed them to sort of bend the broader culture toward theirs, as they promised a do it if it feels good, do whatever's your thing, man, kind of mentality. We simply allowed the 60s generation to replace self-control with self-expression in our country. And now many of these flower children are in charge of so many levers of power in our country, in academia, media, big government, big tech. Now, the term war on drugs does, in fact, actually come from Richard Nixon in 1971, but it was not a literal call to arms. It was designed to be a metaphorical call to arms, a moral equivalent to war, in exactly the same way that his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, had done with his war on poverty, or subsequently Jimmy Carter had done with his war on cancer. By the way, how are we doing with those two other wars, huh? But it's little remembered today that Nixon's principal weapon in his war on drugs was actually drug treatment. Nixon increased funding eightfold within 2 years, consuming fully 2/3 of the total drug control budget and dwarfing the monies allocated to the supply side or enforcement programs across the federal government. But the president and the nation would come to learn the limitations of government's ability to affect behavior solely through compassionate or therapeutic means. You see, without the ability to compel drug users into treatment and to keep them there, initial drug treatment failed 90 to 95% of the time. In fact, fast forward to today, initial drug treatment fails 90 to 95% of the time. That's why it's called a chronic relapsing condition. In fact, Boston University recently did a study that showed the mean number of drug treatment episodes was 6.9 times over a 6.5-year period before finally taking hold. And as far as long-term effectiveness of drug prevention programs, we've learned that unless we bring down drug supply at the same time, drug prevention programs have been minimally effective. What made a difference in Nixon's day was actually targeting the Corsican Italian mafia supplying the vast majority of heroin to Americans at that time, known as the French Connection. It was law enforcement that brought down this nation's first opioid epidemic, and it would be law enforcement that would do it again and again against future drug threats and future transnational criminal organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, here's one of my main points today, and that is that given the limited effectiveness of treatment and prevention programs, law enforcement may actually be the most effective and the most compassionate treatment and prevention program available to us today. And we should say so without apology. And since many of our critics are fond of using the language of science, let's meet them on the same playing field, shall we? Every drug crisis, like a virus, spreads like an epidemic. And in fighting viruses like yellow fever, for instance, we cannot just target the pathogen itself. We also target their vectors, in this case, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And so, too, with every drug epidemic, we cannot just target the pathogen itself, the drugs. We also must go after their vectors, i.e., the drug traffickers. Now, the homeless crisis across America, as you know, is actually a crisis of addiction. It's been estimated that 80% of all of our homeless population are addicted to opioids today. The other 20% actually to methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, alcohol, glue, some combination thereof. In Los Angeles County alone, 65,000 people live in these filthy and squalid tent cities, ushering in diseases not seen since medieval times. Typhus, bubonic plague, leprosy, not to mention skyrocketing levels of crime for miles surrounding these places. You know, it's been said that our city leaders are paralyzed with indecision on what to do with these things. No, they're actually paralyzed with tolerance. Their only answer thus far has just been to pass out more and more in the lock zone, more benevolent programs, and of course a continual strategy of obfuscation and denial. The White House Office of National Drug Control Policy estimates that the average heavy opioid user today spends over $1,800 a month buying illegal narcotics. So using this as our baseline, we can project out that just supplying these West Coast homeless populations from Los Angeles to Seattle earns the various Mexican cartels almost $2 billion a year. That's why they're lined up servicing these camps, further exacerbating the problem. This has been allowed to flourish not because of our liberal progressive policies have been incompletely applied, but rather because they've been perfectly applied. But we're made to believe that our prisons are filled with drug users, that mass incarceration has been spawned by the drug war. These aren't just misguided notions, they're dangerous lies. On any given day in our country, there are roughly 1.4 million people behind bars in our various state prisons. And of that total, less than 15% are there for drug violations. But that's not the figure I want you to look at. I want you to look at the other side of that equation there. 85% of our state inmates are there for rape, robbery, murder, aggravated assault, grand larceny. Ladies and gentlemen, our prisons are not filled with drug users. They're not even filled with drug traffickers. They're filled with violent criminals and serial thieves. And they are exactly where they need to be if we care one whit about the protection of society. It's become fashionable, though, to mock and vilify those who enforce the law as the bad guys, the ones standing in the way of unrestrained liberty. These are the children of chaos. They've been allowed to flourish and threaten us all by both a polluted popular culture and politicians who pander instead of lead. These protesters take to the street to express their indignation of what they consider to be systemic police racism and oppression. But I would remind you that indignation is not a counter-argument or an opposing principle. It's an emotion. At its core, it's an emotion of selfishness, of narcissism. Simply allows these protesters to feel good about themselves. And I would remind you that although law enforcement does in fact bear an immense responsibility for building and maintaining trust with their community, we should never forget that the community shares in that responsibility too. Now, by now, everybody knows that we're in a catastrophic emergency with overdose deaths. As I said earlier, more than 107,000 a year and continuing to rise. But it's not just fentanyl. Clearly, fentanyl is driving about 3/4 of the current overdose death rate. But also, principally, cocaine and methamphetamine overdoses are out of control. And it all has to do with one thing: supply being pumped into this country by the various Mexican cartels. And as we know, Border Patrol seizures are just an indication of the total amount of drugs being smuggled into this country. With fentanyl, we've seen a 500% increase in just the last 3 years. They are simply trying to addict as many people as they can in the United States. As was said earlier, they don't care one whit about us. They just care about profits. Now, this quote actually comes from a opioid addict who made this statement to a journalist just a few days before he overdosed and died and presumably met God. But this is actually a very insightful comment which says the same thing that many scientists try to tell us in scientific terms, that given the fact that drugs, especially opioids, provide such an intense pleasure to the human brain, that many of our citizens, in fact, many people throughout the world, choose not to care about the potential consequences, including death. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why drugs are controlled. That's why they're illegal. And by now, everybody knows the evidence is not just incontrovertible, it's overwhelming that the American pharmaceutical industry caused our current forest fire of opioid addiction that continues to burn out of control. Since 1999, when they got approval from the FDA to prescribe prescription opioids for pretty much anything they wanted to, 500,000 Americans have been killed. That's 500,000 people. But the prescription pill phenomenon, which has largely or somewhat been controlled lately, of course it's been completely eclipsed by the Mexican cartels with counterfeit pills, exploded the myth that it's actually the illegality of drugs or the war on drugs that's been the problem. Legal, regulated, taxed, yet still highly abused. The prescription pill phenomenon proves the point that it's not been the illegality of drugs or the war on drugs that's been the problem. It's the drugs themselves. It's about availability and acceptability. And as I said, it's about the drugs themselves, which don't merely provide euphoria or intoxication, but godlike sensations. And as I said, here's the problem today. Counterfeit pills containing just fentanyl, designed and marketed to be Percocet, oxycodone, you name it. Unfortunately, the Mexican cartels are not real good at uniformly blending fentanyl with the various binders and fillers. So many of these pills here have a hot dose, a lethal amount, which is what has spurred DEA to have their one pill can kill public relations campaign, which is absolutely appearing to do nothing. Now you can buy a kilo of finished fentanyl still from a rogue Chinese chemist in Guangzhou or Shanghai, China, for about $3,000 to $5,000. Turn that into about $1.5 million on the streets of the United States. There simply is no better low-volume, high-value product out there better than fentanyl, and that's why it's not going away anytime soon. Our most tolerant and compassionate nation welcomes into this world now one baby born every 15 minutes suffering from the horrid effects of opioid withdrawal. That doesn't even include the number of babies born to mothers on other drugs. And although modern science has come very far in trying to treat these tiniest of victims with microdoses of drugs like buprenorphine, their suffering is still said to be excruciating. You know, it's been said that the moral worth of a people can be judged by how they treat the most vulnerable and innocent among them. By this standard, our modern culture's stupefying indulgence of the irresponsible at the expense of the blameless and defenseless suggests a culture that has become enfeebled and cowardly in the face of vice. But as I said earlier, it's not just fentanyl. It's driving overdose deaths. Methamphetamine imports into the U.S. from the Mexican cartels have increased tenfold in the last decade. They're simply flooding this country with more methamphetamine than we've ever seen before, producing it in these industrial-scale laboratories scattered all across Mexico with a never-ending supply of precursor chemicals from China. There was some good news recently. Back in 2018, acting on a tip from DEA, Mexican authorities raided a complex of underground meth labs in the mountains of Sinaloa belonging to Ismael Zambada, the heir apparent to the Gulf Cartel after Chapo Guzman's demise, seized 50 metric tons of methamphetamine in various stages of production. That was a hell of a hit for law enforcement that day. That's 50 metric tons that never saw the streets of the U.S. That's good news. But here's the bad news. Since these Mexican cartels adapt and evolve in Darwinian fashion, they no longer put their eggs in these large single baskets. What this did was break up meth production in Mexico into more numerous, atomized, industrial-located meth labs all over Mexico, making it that much harder to attack the problem at the source. Okay, October 17, 2019 marks a critical turning point in Mexico's response to the drug cartels. On that date, Mexican military forces launched an operation to capture Ovidio Guzman, the son of El Chapo, known across Mexico as El Chapito, or the Little Chapo. They did in fact capture their prisoner in a daring raid, but almost immediately, the Sinaloa drug cartel responded with such a violent, overwhelming, and militaristic response of their own that it resulted in, excuse the pun, a Mexican standoff. Ultimately, the president of Mexico himself, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO as he's known, personally interceded and ordered his own troops to surrender and cough up the prisoner, saying, "We do not want war," obviously failing to realize he was already in one. Such a stunning decision, one that would have lasting and profound impact, not just for Mexico, but to the U.S. and the world, had just led to the surrender of an entire sovereign nation to the thugs and desperados. Here's who's in charge of Mexico now. Just like the warlords in Afghanistan, it's the drug cartels who control large swaths of Mexico. And Americans had better start thinking about what that's going to mean to our own national security, to have a failed state right on our border. Now, just want to make a couple of quick comments about marijuana. It's what I call the cultural fault line of our time. Marijuana legalization advocates have been surprisingly effective at convincing the public that legalizing weed can all in all be a good thing. But I believe people who believe that have been duped. Pawns in a colossal con at the hands of legalizers who have been very effective at utilizing two things: an appeal to emotion and endless repetition, the two key ingredients to any piece of propaganda. That and, of course, a whole bunch of money from people like George Soros, who, as you know, is out to completely transform not just the U.S., but the world. Wants to create a one-world socialist government, open borders, mass immigration, and his favorite topic, the legalization of all drugs. Known as Daddy Weed Bucks to the marijuana legalization lobby, he's personally contributed over $52 million trying to get weed legalized in every single state across the country. 2012, the National Academy of Sciences issued a landmark study that's been confirmed many times since that smoking marijuana in adolescent years decreases one's IQ up to 8 points permanently. There you go. That's why it's called dope. It makes you stupid. It makes you burned out, stupefied, and lazy. It's turning an entire generation of young Americans into a dumbed-down segment of our society, something we're all going to suffer from. But it's not just the bad guys we're fighting. We've got wealthy investors lining up with Wall Street trying to legalize marijuana at the federal level. How many of you know that one of the most prolific lobbyists for legal marijuana in our country right now is former Republican Speaker of the House, John Boehner? As far as I'm concerned, he's become nothing but a whore to the marijuana trade. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no such thing. No other medicine in our pharmacological field has been approved for ingestion by smoking its raw form versus medicines that are carefully isolated, purified, measured, and then administered in exact accordance with a particular illness or condition. Medical marijuana is just like the snake oil sales of the 19th century, where apparently any ailment can be cured for anyone at any time and any amount, simply on the recommendation of a doctor. It is nothing less than the triumph of bullshit. The average medical marijuana smoker is actually 30 years old, has been smoking weed for 15 years, and has no major medical condition. Recently, the commander of the U.S. Army Recruiting Command said that 3/4 of our young people today, 3/4, are unfit for military service. Either physically, meaning they're too obese or out of shape to pass the PT test. Cognitively, they can't pass the Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude Test. Or morally, meaning they have an arrest record or are using some other drug. Marijuana has been a huge driver in all of those. Okay, back to Mexico, the border. This just happens to be one of many tunnels that was discovered has been discovered over the years between Mexico and the U.S. to smuggle drugs and God knows whatever else into the United States. But this particular tunnel in 2016 was just a little bit different. This tunnel, based upon certain engineering traits that the Border Patrol hadn't ever seen before, to include the particular gauge of the rail system designed to rapidly move drugs across the half-a-mile-long tunnel here, or the sophisticated nature of the ventilation system, caused them to call over experts from the Israeli Defense Forces, which confirmed their suspicion that this particular tunnel, based upon certain telltale engineering traits, had the hallmarks of Hezbollah tunnels dug from Lebanon into Israel to conduct terrorist operations. You tell me what that might mean. Ladies and gentlemen, our greatest enemies in the struggle are actually not the bad guys, the gangbangers, the narco-terrorists. It's our own ignorance and indifference. And as we know, those are both contagious. But so are courage and engagement. You can push back. You must push back. Every night in your city, there are parents praying that their children not get exposed to drugs. No matter who you are and what you do, you can help be the answer to those prayers. Now, I want to talk about 4 broad areas real quickly about what I think as a nation, as a culture, as a government that we need to do to fight back. And my law enforcement audiences, I always talk about how law enforcement is at the forefront of this, not just because of their inherent authority, but because they're in it every day. They see it every day. First thing we need to do is tell the public, teach the public what law enforcement knows, that drugs doesn't just simply destroy individual lives and steal individual souls. It devastates and decays entire societies and communities. That law enforcement is not engaged in mass incarceration, nor are prisons are filled with mere drug users. That marijuana is in fact not just a gateway drug, but a kind of catalyst that primes the brain for other types of drugs. That treatment and prevention have not been largely very effective unless we bring down supply at the same time. Now, we're constantly lectured that we must not stigmatize those who are addicted and thus need our help. Well, I don't believe anyone, public or private, actually targets for abuse those who willingly step forward seeking help for their demons. No, that's a straw man argument designed to absolve drug users of any responsibility. But since we know that the vast majority of all drug addiction starts as recreational drug taking, that's precisely the kind of behavior we must stigmatize, at least every bit as much as our society has done with tobacco. We have to stigmatize the 15-year-old boy who thinks he's cool smoking weed after school with his friends, the college girl who thinks she's sophisticated ordering fentanyl pills off the dark web or Snapchat or Instagram and then paying for it with some virtual currency like Bitcoin or Zcash. And most of all, we need to stigmatize those media and social influences that normalize and glamorize drug use. What I'm talking about here is responsibility. This is not Washington, D.C.'s problem to solve. Yes, they're part of the solution, but the only way we're going to get a handle on this is if individuals take control of their own lives, demonstrate what I call their first policeman, individual self-control, personal responsibility. Quite simply, individual character and lawful behavior matter. They matter for self, and cumulatively, they matter for society. If not, then as Edwin Delattre has warned, the country's resources will be exhausted in efforts to save the citizens from themselves. Lastly, we must commit to resourcing law enforcement better in this country at every level, local, state, federal, internationally, and absolutely at the Mexican border, where we know the threat emanates from. Drug trafficking is not a non-violent crime. In fact, at more than 107,000 drug poisonings in our country every year and rising, it has rightfully been called the most murderous criminal activity in the history of America. We know after 50 years of experience since Nixon declared his war on drugs that treatment and prevention are only strategically effective when law enforcement reduces drug availability. We proved that law enforcement worked in the 1960s against LSD, against our nation's first opioid epidemic, heroin in the 1970s, cocaine in the 80s, crack in the 90s, meth labs in the 2000s. All of those reductions were not complete, but they were greatly reduced by aggressive and fair law enforcement and the application of the rule of law. We also need a whole of government approach. This is not just a law enforcement problem, it's a societal problem. We need to have every single cabinet level agency in government involved in this, just like the current administration is doing with their green agenda. And now I'm not against environmentalism, but this stuff here is actually much more important than electric vehicles. You know, back in the 1980s, when cocaine was first pouring out of Colombia into our country, President Reagan called up his Colombian counterpart and he said, you know, you guys either need to start doing something yourselves about the production and export of cocaine, or you might as well stop sending us your coffee and cut flowers. And you know what? Colombia stepped up and became one of our greatest allies and partners over the years. That's exactly what we need to do with China today relative to precursor chemicals. And lastly, this is the most important. We can do this right now. We need to declare every single one of our Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations to bring new tools to bear. Now, getting ready to wrap this up here, I spent some time with my law enforcement audiences talking about what I call the 5 C's, but I just want to mention bullet number 4 here. We absolutely need to have compassion for our fellow citizens, but not just for those who are addicted today, for the hordes who will be victimized tomorrow, for the children today who have a right to grow up in a drug-free environment, for the 90% of Americans who do not use illegal drugs and therefore uphold the law and not degrade and demean it. Compassion is different than sympathy. Sympathy is merely an emotion. True compassion is actually sympathy coupled with action, the kind of action designed to achieve justice and fairness. Now, these are my 3 kids, and obviously they chose to fight in a little different way than I have. But they know the same thing all of you here today do, that civilization must be defended, that this is our society, one worth fighting for, and fight we must, not just with caring and compassion, but also with an aggressive and wide-ranging drug law enforcement response that upholds the rule of law and what is right, against a constant onslaught of predators who only look to get rich off the backs of addiction. To not target, arrest, and imprison those who prey upon our fellow citizens, sometimes with unimaginable violence and barbarity, would not just be cowardly, it would be immoral.